Hi, this is David Mills. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the most important question of all, and we're going to be answering that question. I don't take pride in fighting for what's right, which is often people talk about we have to fight for various things. I'm interested in winning, not fighting. Asking the right question is nice and a very good first step, but it's ultimately worthless unless we answer that question. So let's answer that right now, the world's most important question, which is how can we know what is true? If you seriously pursue any question, any issue, if you want a happy romantic relationship, if you want to make more money, if you want to succeed at any particular task or project, and if you want to figure out what's right in a more deep way about God, about things having to do with religion or politics, in every case, if you want to raise your children and have them be happy and prosperous or whatever you'd like for them, then if you keep pursuing the idea of how to do that by asking better and more fundamental questions to build the right foundation for yourself, which is what someone does if they're properly pursuing something, is they keep asking deeper questions until they get to the bottom of it, and then they build back up. So no matter what you pursue, if you're really serious about success, you would come to the question of, wait, how can I know what's true? How can I distinguish? I'm not really talking about, how can I distinguish fake news? That's something people talk about a lot. And of course it's real that there's plenty of issues with news, right? But it's not really about that. We can get more basic than that in terms of understanding what's true and in terms of removing bad ideas. So let's get started. We're going to need to understand 4 parts of what to do. And as we combine them together, then you're going to be able to be in an entirely different paradigm. Everything about culture, society, how we think, what we mean when we say, I'll think about it, when you make decisions on a moment-by-moment basis, when you respond to other people on a moment-to-moment basis, when you make larger decisions, when you make kind of different decisions about what path you're going to take, whether you'll leave your job, what job to go into, what project or sub-project to do in your own business, et cetera, et cetera. How to respond when there's an issue in your romantic relationship or some other relationship. Just what to do with your day, what's most important, right? See, if you can figure out what's true, then what you do is you're looking to see what's true about what's important, right? What to focus on during the day that's going to give you your biggest return. And then when you figure out in general, okay, I want to focus on making more money, or I want to get whatever, whether it be affecting the world or whether it be something to get yourself ahead, and those are all valid things, then you need to be figuring out again what's important, what's going to get you a great return, what's good relative to your goals that you have. And then you can think about your goals themselves, whether they're what you want them to be, whether they're aligned, and so forth. So you can start using this on the most important things and getting your ideas straight, the conceptual boxes that you operate in. You can start to notice when something is fundamentally wrong with some assumption that you're making. You might not even know what's right. Often when you're figuring out what's true, you just figure out what I'm assuming right now, or part of what I'm assuming, or something about my thinking right now about this topic or overall is not right. But that's a major deal if you are certain, if you're clear, if you're 100% sure that you're in the wrong place or in the wrong relationship or working on the wrong thing, then you can know that it's worth any amount of resources to, or any amount of getting, not worrying about your sunk cost, what you've already put into investing in what you're currently doing. If you know that it's not headed where you need it to be, then you can comfortably leave it, and that's ultimately what you'll have to do. So knowing is different than what we're used to. We're used to ultimately, if we disagree with someone or whatever, okay, well, you have your opinion, I have mine, or you might secretly think that they're stupid and immoral, but there's still a certain sense that whatever the issue is, large or small, personal or global, or more societal, that we really can't know certain things for certain. And it's so when we put these four components together, we are going to be able to know things in a way that right now everything about your thinking is kind of based on what we're talking about in this video not existing, not being possible. This question's never really been solved before, and it's certainly the common understanding, either people in general, or what the experts or the famous philosophers or any of those places or famous religions, any of it, none of them have answered this question. Right? Their answers are all weak and false and fake, and they don't really even claim mostly to have any kind of answer that is solid on how to know what's true. Instead, there's some excuse or pretty obviously fake substitute. I won't get into examples right now, but we can over time see. Because you can do this for yourself. None of this is relying on me except for to show you for the first time. And then it's on you to use this method for yourself. It will be true in a way that's undeniable as you understand it. All right, so the first thing that we need to get is a paradigm shift. None of what I'm really covering is actually complicated, although no one's figured it out. But it's not complicated like calculus or rocket science or something that's complicated. There's not a lot to remember. But this first concept involves a kind of major paradigm shift from what you might be used to. And it's like seeing through an illusionary wall. It's not, again, complex, but you have to see something that previously you saw in a different way. But you're not going to have to take my word for anything. You're just going to need to make a certain shift, or when the shift is made, kind of hold on to it. So we're normally used to, first of all, identifying with our brain and body as if it's us, and we're fundamentally kind of different than either one of those things. I would use the word being to describe who we are, but we'll get to that. So we're used to something that can be called naive realism, or and this is a different term, is something different, representational realism. People are generally kind of caught in between both of those ideas, neither of which is correct. So naive realism is known to various philosophers and scientists who study perception as obviously wrong, even though we assume it all the time, like kind of without thinking about it. And that is that when you look around and you see like a table, or you see a tree, or you look at your hand, or whatever you look at or hear, but we'll just think about sight for a moment. This applies to any kind of sense, and also your kind of internal thoughts and memories and feelings. But we can it's easiest to dwell on visual for the moment, so we'll do that. So when you look around, naive realism, again, is something that we assume without really thinking about it, and it works plenty of the time. And that is pretty much like what you see is what's there. Like when you look at a chair or a tree, you're seeing a chair as it exists, as it is. And we don't really make a distinction between our internal representation of what we see and the external reality of it. Those are kind of blended together in our way of operating and understanding the world. And so people think, they kind of function and think without thinking about it, as if they're experiencing the external physical world directly, that they're looking at it, seeing it as it is. That's called naive realism. That's not the case. And then I'll probably explain, but I'll either explain or by showing you what's correct, then you'll see how it's wrong. So one way or the other, I'll continue, but I'm gonna, as part of my attempt to explain this as efficiently as possible, I'll skip to representational realism. Representational realism holds that we see, like in the case of sight, for example, we see or experience consciously a visual image of what's there that's not the exact same thing as the tree, right? Like it's known within science, or just basically generally understood, that like if you look at a tree and the leaves are green, the green that you experience is not inherent to the tree molecules, right? The idea is, and the idea that I'm not disputing or not, it's like a model. It's not really the type of thing that's exactly true or not, but it works. Is that the tree molecules are emitting photons at different wavelengths, and those are interpreted as green by your brain, right? But that it's commonly understood in science that that you can figure this out philosophically too. I'm just kind of being quick here because it's not really in dispute, right? That we kind of all know, so to speak, that the tree itself isn't really green, right? It's made up of molecules and atoms that make up molecules and so forth, and then there's subatomic particles, and then there's photons of light and all that stuff, and the green is more like part of a representation created by our brain, right? So when it comes to a number of these philosophical ideas that we'll be touching on here, people often have contradictory. They simultaneously have mutually exclusive or contradictory beliefs about the world, just depending on the situation. So people can be made to affirm naive realism, like, yeah, I look at the tree, I see what's there, I see the tree as it is. Simultaneously, people have beliefs that, okay, wait, I don't really see the tree exactly, it is. The green is created by my mind, in a sense, based on photons. There's an underlying physical reality to it, and so forth. What we want to do here as law of implication practitioners, and of course that's just a fun name that I can use to identify my teaching, but me saying it's not about the law of implication being right, it's about discovering what's correct, right? Just like basic math. When you understand basic math, certain things are just correct, and you can understand why they are. And as a matter of fact, the method in this video will apply equally to basic math, and you can see how it's correct with that too. But what we want to make a shift is to bypass the whole issue about the physical world, because what happens is when we start trying to think about what's true about the external world in one step or directly, or when our thinking about what's true is based on what can be called empiricism, which is like experimenting and experiencing the external world and seeing what works, what can be duplicated, the scientific method, and so forth. We are getting ahead of ourselves. We're skipping to something where we actually can't know what's true. And it causes us to miss a vast amount of really important ideas that we can know are true. So what we want to learn to do is make a shift where you don't actually need to understand about perception or what's going on when your eyes and your visual center in your brain interacts with the molecules and photons with a tree and light bouncing off and all that stuff. That's actually all irrelevant. I describe it more for the sake of contrast. What we want to do is learn to think more basically in terms of something that's actually the most obvious thing that you are aware of, which is your consciousness screen. And when I'm talking about so I'm kind of coining this term for us to use. But what we're doing is we're going to talk about what you experience visually, and then how you feel, what you feel like you experience from other senses as well, and then also part of your conscious screen is your internal feelings, memories, anything that's like you picture in your mind, or what you would call your thoughts. Absolutely anything that you experience, again, in what you would think of as internally or external, we're going to call all of that your consciousness screen. So if you look at a tree and you see a tree, we're going to stop worrying for the time being. We're going to make a paradigm shift. You don't have to think this way all the time. The paradigm shift is to be able to see what I'm saying while we are thinking about it, is to have the alternative of looking at things the way I'm talking about. All right. So you just need to see and get a glimpse of what I'm saying. I'm not saying you need to think about this all the time. Kind of like if you visit a foreign country that has a very different culture than yourself, and then you come back home, you might have a paradigm shift and realize things about the world that you never realized that people could think or experience. And some might be good, some might be bad, but it still might cause a certain openness and paradigm shift in you. Even while you're not looking at it, your mind is still expanded. And that's what we need to do regarding this first idea of consciousness screen. Once we have this basis or foundation, then you're going to have the potential ability to think clearly and accurately in a way that would be previously undreamt of and would be impossible. And that you're going to be able to have a foundation for your success by eliminating so many ideas that are incorrect or partially incorrect, or where you kind of believe the right thing and the wrong thing in different parts of your psyche and mind, and it kind of messes you and holds you back and creates limiting beliefs and all that stuff. And it all boils down to having this experience right now with me, or replaying this or thinking about it until it happens, where again, it's like if you visit a different land, different place, different culture, and it's like eye-opening for you. So I'm trying to give you that. So what I'm referring to is to be able to think about your basis for the knowledge and your experience of the world from the standpoint of you directly experience your consciousness screen, and in some way, shape, or form, you know it. Now, we're going to have another distinction when I talk about mismatching scenarios and those two things, to further understand how to use your consciousness field, your consciousness screen. And I'm just talking about how you most basically experience the world, right? I'm not talking about consciousness in kind of a foo-foo or weird or odd way. I'm not saying you need to be more conscious or use your conscious ability more or anything like that. I've sometimes in the past used the phrase, I first coined the phrase consciousness field to mean the exact same thing, but the word screen is just a little bit more like accurate, like the connotation of it, so I'm using that. But if I slip and I say consciousness field, I mean the same thing. But I'm not referring to some energy field or some power field or anything like that, or some metaphysical awareness. I'm talking about the most basic awareness that everyone has. Just when you look around, if you see stuff. And what we want to do is have a paradigm shift where you stop worrying about whether what you see is exactly what's correct or real, and instead you can analyze what you see more for like what it is. Again, as I just continue talking, we'll make sense of this. It's such a foundational paradigm shift that it's hard to get underneath it and describe it. We just have to kind of use it and play around with it a bit for you to continue to understand what I mean. If you, unless you kind of got lucky or whatever and kind of got it already. So for example, suppose you try to remember what you did yesterday, right? You'll have certain memories. And there's a separate question of whether your memories are accurate or vivid, right? If you imagine being really happy or really upset yesterday, or if you try to remember that, right? Let's say you got at one point quite happy yesterday, and at some point you were pretty unhappy, let's say yesterday, and you try to remember those times, you might actually feel less emotion right now when you're remembering than you did yesterday, right? In quote unquote real life, or when it really happened, right? At those moments. So right now, when you're remembering it, that memory, though, regardless of whether it's accurate relative to what actually happened or what you actually felt yesterday, the memory itself that you're thinking of right now, if you were thinking of a memory right now, that's what's in your consciousness screen right now. So what we want to do is be able to conceptualize the difference between, for example, how accurate your memory is about yesterday versus just the very fact of being aware of the memory itself. Do you see those are two different things? If I were to ask like how you feel about an event yesterday right now, or what you remember of it, is identical to what you remember of it right now. Like what I'm saying, what you're remembering right now is identical, matches what you're remembering right now, because I'm just basically repeating myself, right? It doesn't necessarily match what actually happened yesterday. My point here is not the obvious point that it doesn't necessarily match your memory right as you experience it right now doesn't match yesterday. My point is I want you to notice something, which is your memory as you experience it now is your memory as you experience it right now. And in some sense, or your knowledge has to be based in what you're aware of right now, this moment. That has to be the foundation for our knowledge. When we start to conflate that and confuse it and not be able to distinguish it between whether or not, in this case, your memory is accurate, or if you feel like you hear a sound and you think it's maybe an intruder, but it's really just your heater getting charged up, or someone that you didn't realize was suppose you hear someone walking upstairs if you live in a house and there's 2 stories and you thought that no one was home and you freak out and think maybe someone broke into your home, right? But actually it's just, a member of your family is home and you didn't realize it. So your guess about what that sound meant of those footsteps is incorrect, right? However, what's not incorrect is what's in your consciousness screen, not about what we want to do is separate the conclusion from the experience itself and understand that we still know the experience itself. So suppose you hear footsteps upstairs and you feel like there's an intruder, then what's true is you heard the footsteps, or you're hearing, or you feel like you're hearing, right? Your experience feels like it's of hearing footsteps, and you feel the conclusion that, oh, maybe that's an intruder, or it's definitely an intruder, or I feel panic or afraid or aggressive or whatever you might feel. What we want to, again, create this distinction where we're aware of the difference between a conclusion of what it means, like in real life, so to speak, or in the environment or the external world, and your direct awareness of something in your consciousness screen. A conclusion that's false in this case, of you concluding that it's an intruder, that was false. But your awareness of the conclusion is still your awareness of the conclusion. It's true that you felt, or you feel in this scenario, it's true that you feel like there's an intruder. Does that make sense? Whether or not there actually is an intruder, you can still accurately experience your experience. Be aware of large, clear things in your experience. As we start to examine what we know about our consciousness screen, a couple of things start to make us wonder or ask certain good questions. Like, all right, suppose I own a lawn, or I'm, for some reason, standing in front of a lawn of grass. Then, in one sense, I could look at that lawn and be like, yeah, the lawn, the grass is in my consciousness screen right now, right? I'm directly aware, regardless of what's actually true or how the lawn really is in the external world or the physical world. I have an awareness of the lawn. And I feel like I'm seeing grass, right? I have a visual experience of seeing grass, whatever. At the same time, you don't know how many blades of grass there are. What exactly are you aware of is a little hard to pin down, right? Like, there's maybe a lot of blades of grass, but then what exactly do you know about what you're seeing can start to lead to some questions where you're not quite sure. However, the basis for our thinking and our knowledge has to start at our consciousness screen, at what we're directly aware of. Again, regardless of how that ends up relating to some external world and how it ends up being true about an external world. So we need to be able to separate out our conclusions. We're so used to our thoughts and our conclusions about what's true about our thoughts being one and the same without a space between them. Like if you're driving and someone cuts you off or does something obnoxious, another driver, and you're like, oh, that person's a jerk, right? Like when somebody has that conclusion, or if you imagine someone doing that, not being a jerk, but you as a driver feeling like, oh, that person's a jerk, we can imagine it being the case that there's not really a space or a question in between the feeling or thought that the person's a jerk versus the conclusion being true that the person's a jerk. Do you see there are two different things, right? Like if my brain gives me, or however we refer to it, but if it comes into your consciousness screen, the idea that the person's a jerk, it doesn't actually mean that the person it's really true that the person's a jerk. But what is true is that it came into your consciousness screen, the thought that the person's a jerk. Do you see? So you know you had the thought, or you're having the thought, but the conclusion may or may not be right. My main point is not that people's conclusions can sometimes be wrong. We kind of know that, even if we forget it moment by moment. It's useful to be aware to be differently aware that your conclusions can be wrong. But the real important thing here is we take it for granted that sometimes we're wrong about stuff. Like we realize that if we hear footsteps and we feel a sense of panic, like it's probably an intruder or it is an intruder, we realize that kind of thing can be wrong. And if we do find out that actually it's somebody home, we don't have like a major epistemological crisis of like, oh, how does knowledge work and how does perception work, right? We're just like, oh, haha, oops, I thought it was this and it was wrong. But because it's actually fairly common that our conclusions end up being wrong, like our expectations of reality end up not being met, it's called expectation failure. Because of that, we feel like, well, we don't always like know what's true. And so we can't always trust like our perceptions or our conclusions, but it just ends up getting ruined where we can just kind of end up giving up on knowing what's true. And then we just come up with random crap like, oh, go with your heart, or if you really believe something, that's your truth, or just things that are really end up being very false and weak and really poisonous to basically just wave your hand and give up about the question of what's true. So I'm talking around this issue because it's a difficult, in the sense, it's a difficult paradigm shift to make or to understand really what I'm saying, even though it's the most basic thing to you in your existence, because it's what it is. It's so obvious, your consciousness screen to you, but it's so mixed all the time in with something that it's not obvious. So your consciousness screen is like pretty much literally right in front of your face, right? Or metaphorically, kind of somewhere between metaphorically and literally right in front of your face. But it's mixed with these conclusions about the world that your mind gives you simultaneous to your experience. And so we don't have it as a distinction. And so when I start talking about it, people get confused with what it's normally mishmashed with, again, which is conclusions about the world. In order for us to be able to build an understanding of what's true, we need to be able to separate out the raw material from the conclusions. And then we need to be able to use the raw material properly. When I say raw material, I'm referring again to your consciousness screen. Everything that you're aware of directly, not even you as, it doesn't matter about what your eyes see or how your eyes work or your brain. You don't have to know anything about physiology. It's not relevant. Right? If you think it is, you're misunderstanding consciousness screen. You could know nothing about or have no sense of yourself as a physical body or having a mind or brain, and still you would be experiencing what you experience. Right? The idea that you could even not even have the distinction of sight versus hearing or whatever. Whatever you experience is what you experience. It doesn't mean you remember it the next moment, but one way or the other, our knowledge about the world has to be built off of what we experience. Now, let me interject something here that will maybe help you now and eventually will help you, and it's something that at some point you'll need to come to understand. Our brain is not conscious, and yet we are. It's the most obvious thing, literally, is that you're conscious. If you understood what I mean by conscious. It means you're aware of something rather than nothing. To not be conscious would mean you're literally aware of nothing ever. Right? And so the most obvious thing is that that's not true. It's not true that you're not aware of anything ever. I know there's a lot of nots there, but again, it's the most obvious thing. So you could probably figure out what I mean or rewind it or something. So the most basic thing to our existence from the moment you started to exist was that you were in fact aware of something. You were conscious of something. We're also so used to identifying with our brain and our body as well, but as ourselves. But the bizarre thing is that our brain is not conscious. If we continue on this line of reasoning, then our brain not being conscious still processes the world. It's involved with observing and recording stuff about the world to interpret, to give you conclusions, to have memories, and to allow you to have some kind of continuity. Like if you were conscious, but at every moment there was no such thing as any memory with the previous instant, then you couldn't do anything, right? Ultimately what's going on in existence, I'm going to have to just assert this for now. Of course, I'll explain all this over time. And I'm not just going to ever assert something at you and expect you to know it or think it's true because I just say it. But just to give you a sense of what kind of all wraps this stuff up is God exists. God's conscious. God's aware. God's awesome. And God has created a world. God could have made a world where we're all in what would amount to a drug-induced bliss, where we all felt perfectly blissful all the time. So why didn't God do that? And the only reason turns out to be that there's something even better. Literally, we're living in a world that's even better than permanent bliss. And how is that the case? It's because by having the capacity to love, we're able to experience both the bliss, not necessarily in this moment, but we'll be able to, we can, and more because we love and we care about, we choose to care about others, and their happiness will further our happiness in addition to just our own sense of bliss or, pleasure or whatever. So again, the world is even better than just permanent bliss. But to make it that way, there needs to be to make it so that so love makes a condition in the future that's even better than like a permanent drug-induced bliss where you live forever in this perfect bliss. Love makes possible something even better than that, which is that plus caring about other people and being happy about their happiness, interacting with them. But a logical prerequisite for love is free will, which is not to be confused with omnipotence, but it just means that you have some, even if it's a tiny trickle of choice or something where you have leverage or the ability to affect reality and make choices, but you need to have some of that. Without some of that, you don't have a resource with which to love. It's logically necessary for love. For that to occur, God can't choreograph everything. God creates everything every moment, but God needs to have regular laws by which there's a continuity from moment by moment, because if you contrast that with the opposite, which would be utter chaos, where literally every moment was totally disconnected from every other moment, it's hard to imagine that because the world is the opposite of that. Even though the world is not perfectly ordered, there is an overall fundamental set of laws that God upholds. The laws themselves don't exist in and of themselves. They don't have power. Gravity is not something that does anything or is anything. It just describes a regularity with which God operates the physical world. So God can't on a whim violate those without destroying our free will. It doesn't mean God can't interfere in the world. As a matter of fact, as I said, or interfere even with laws. But unless there's some regularity involving that, again, God can't have whims. Like we're used to having like whims, right? Where we could have a lot of people ask us for help and we just decide to help this person or that person, or we feel like this person deserves it and so we'll help them, whatever. If you imagine being like a wealthy philanthropist or whatever. But God can't operate on whims. It doesn't work that way for God. I'm skipping ahead here, but I'm just kind of giving you a sense of some conclusions just to start to make sense of some of this. So God has to create a world where you have some ability to have free will. And of course, as part of that, you have to have some basis for knowledge so you can think about and make decisions with how to use the free will that you have. It's going to turn out that our free will has something is at this point can be described pretty well by saying that you have the option to seek understanding even if you feel absolutely certain. And otherwise, you're not really exercising your free will. And if you choose to seek understanding about what's true and good and important, even when you feel like you're sure, then that will start to improve the quality of your ideas. You'll start to discover how to slice away some bad ideas that you get in your mind that you absorb from when you're little. All right. So I say all these things to help point to this idea of a consciousness screen as distinct from the conclusions that your mind, your brain, those aren't synonyms, but they're often interchangeable in practice with what I'm talking about stuff. So your brain actually processes the world despite not being conscious, and plays a role, presumably a major role, in giving you conclusions about what things mean simultaneous to you experiencing things. And so the paradigm shift involves you being able to notice that you're aware of stuff as different from your conclusions about what's true about the world based on what you see. All right. I'll continue to again, as my best guess to help you understand this, I'm going to just continue to the next point, even though I understand that there's just different moments when people might make that shift where they can realize they have a consciousness screen as distinct from conclusions. And as a matter of fact, your brain not being conscious, if you keep thinking that through, it's an extraordinary thing because your brain is actually not aware of your consciousness screen. And yet we assume our mind is aware of what we're seeing. And yet our mind is not aware of what we're seeing, which is a very strange thing. Our mind can't be aware of what when I say seeing, your mind can't be aware of your consciousness screen because your mind is not conscious. Your mind is information processing. You is what I would call a being is conscious. A being is something with the capacity to be conscious. You're like an individual being who's conscious of your consciousness field, and you have some amount of free will, and you're responsible for that. You're capable of love. Your mind is capable of storing the raw materials of love, but you and the consequences of it. But that the choice to love is, and things are yours. But in order to choose something like to love, you can't do things directly. You can only really exercise your free will by seeking to understand things. So to actually love, you have to seek to understand love. Otherwise, you're doing a cheap substitute that feels right to you. And it's coming from your mind and a feeling of certainty and rightness from your mind. But in order to understand what's true, and in order to have the correct answer to the question of how do we know what's true, again, you need to be able to separate out certainty and conclusions that are injected into your consciousness screen, being aware of them without rubber stamping them. That's the key paradigm shift. That's the kind of person, believe me, you want to be in human relationships with, romantic, business, otherwise. A person who, in the face of certainty, can still seek to understand what's correct and differentiate between a feeling of certainty their mind gives them and thinking about what's true. We don't need to question everything in every moment, but what happens is incorrect ideas, certainty that shouldn't be, gives off symptoms. It gives off negative emotions, gives off conclusions that we should violate other people's and their property and so forth when we could know otherwise, right? There may be times to violate another person that pretty much have to revolve around defense of something very specific, a clear and significant violation of our property, our personal property, like our body, our money, our real property, or someone else's being violated. Outside of that, violating a stranger just because you want something or you feel like you or someone else can do something better with their money or their body or their house or whatever, that is not okay. So when people are coming to all sorts of conclusions about that, right? Everything to do with politics is about the idea that we can violate other people for the greater good. And symptoms like that, where we come to the conclusion that we can violate strangers, or that we have other strangers as stand-ins violating other strangers so that we can have stuff we want, right? Programs we want, or roads, or whatever, that can go away. We can stop wanting to be violent towards strangers, like when it's not in clear and obvious defense. We could be in a love relationship and feel like justice is so important. We got to punish this person. They've got to feel what we feel because we feel like they violated something. They may not have, by the way, but we feel upset with the person we're in a love relationship with, and people incorrectly think that fairness or justice, those are different, but there's different concepts, but they're also kind of related and come together a lot. Neither of those is something that leads to good. They're not helpful. They're not helpful as foundational concepts. There's plenty of times when splitting something or doing something fairly is the correct conclusion, but fairness and justice are not foundations. They're not reasons to, again, violate another person. And if you want to be in a love relationship or romantic relationship with somebody, then doing anything for the purposes of justice or fairness, you're coming from the wrong paradigm, and you're going to create a negative spiral for yourself. And that can come up in business plenty too. Okay. So the next thing here is scenarios to build definitions. See, normally people, when they try to think about things, of course, they're using words as a significant part of their thinking. And they'll say stuff like, well, it depends what you mean by God, or it depends how you define God, or how you define religion, or how you define fairness, right? Or how you define respect, right, in a relationship, or, money, is not important, they might say, or all these things. Okay. Or it depends what you mean by success. Well, when we're trying to think accurately in order to come up with, figure out what ideas are correct and sort through ideas that could be hurting us or make important decisions, then one of the real poison pills is when the meanings of our words shift around. And that happens nonstop when people try to think. And not only are words shifting around, but the problem that people have with their normal way of thinking, where they define words with other words, right? If you look at a dictionary, it's a bunch of words defining other words. You're starting out vague. You're starting out ill-defined, right? The very system of defining words with other words is you're compounding vagueness upon vagueness, and you're not in the game to begin with. Like you're kind of losing before you start if you try to think accurately when you don't understand how the basis for your thinking should be. And instead, what we want to do is build the meanings of our words based on scenarios. Now, a scenario could be, all right, so I want to have this business project, right? And we're saying, all right, so what are we starting? Or someone's proposing a business idea. And then we start to say, all right, so how many people are involved and what's our product, right, and so forth. And what we're doing now is a very important word that we can put in here is the word stipulating, right? I'll write that. Scenarios, comma, stipulating. I was once in I was chosen for jury duty, but not where I was an actual juror or even being interviewed to be a juror. They just have like a whole bunch of people that don't get called, but you still have to be like in the courtroom in case they don't have enough people, to call for potential jurors, and then they pick actual jurors. I was just like in the audience, so to speak, but I had to be there. But it kind of in practice opened my eyes to how confusing the idea of stipulating tends to be, even when it's stated very kind of clearly. In this case, there was a woman who was accused of promoting prostitution, not being a prostitute, but in doing something akin to like maybe, I don't know, having a web business that was like kind of advertising or facilitating prostitution, right? So again, so she wasn't accused of being, she was expressly not accused of being a prostitute, but instead of promoting prostitution. So her lawyer for the defense, he asked potential jurors, because they interviewed them, right, to see who they want to nix. He said, suppose that the prosecution presents evidence that has you convinced that the defendant was practicing prostitution, but not promoting prostitution. How would you rule? And a lot of the people, the prospective jurors, they couldn't process it from the idea of a stipulation. And they would say things, well, I'd have to hear the evidence first, right? Or things along the nature of ignoring the fact that it would be like if the lawyer had asked them, what's 2 + 5? And they said, well, I'd have to see what the numbers are first, or something like that. The lawyer stipulated, which means he created a scenario. It doesn't matter what's in quote unquote real life. Again, what these prospective jurors couldn't do was to differentiate between, in essence, their conclusions or their imaginations of the world, like the idea of the real world versus this hypothetical. And when you deal with a conditional or hypothetical or stipulation, you're dealing with it on the terms that are stipulated, that are described. If I say there's 10 people that get stranded on an island, and I use that to try to understand how governments might form and explore that, and why they may or may not be necessary, and how they may or may not make sense, right? Then if someone says, well, maybe there's 11 people, well, I could say, no, there's not 11 people on the island. I'm stipulating there's 10, right? And if I say 6 of them vote to form a government, and then they say, okay, everyone's part of this social contract now, you've all agreed, if you don't like it, leave, then that is what's going on. I'm stipulating that scenario. And by keeping it simple and clear and creating it in that way, we can examine concepts. We can change one thing at a time, take a look at how that might affect things or what it might mean. Here's another one. Might be if you're imagining like a romantic relationship, and suppose that you're hoping there's a 2 people in a romantic relationship, and one of them is trying to kind of interest the other person in being intimate, and the other person doesn't really feel like it, and they say, come on, leave me alone, right? Now I'm just creating that scenario, and it gives us a basis on which to think about things, and then we can add things, and then we can think through what might happen if the person feels like, well, this is not fair, or if the person doing the rebuffing feels like, why does this person have to keep bugging me, about intimacy so much, like they just want it all the time or something like that. And then we can think through, all right, so if they think that, where does that lead, right? But the critical thing here, once again, is to be able to realize we can build scenarios and use them to notice distinctions. People think associatively. So when people think of what a tyranny might look like a government tyranny, then they have certain associations to that. It should look a certain way. Kind of like to a kid, a crook is like someone wearing a mask, right? And maybe a prison jumpsuit or something, right? Like the way Lego crooks look or something like that. To adults, a tyranny kind of has to look a certain way. It should kind of look like a certain type of island dictatorship, maybe, or something like that. But if we were to think about it, what if people couldn't own property, including their own body? What if the government could legally, according to the government's laws, their own laws, legally take your body and use it how it wants, and or your money, and including all of it, and use it how it wants, or do what it wants to it, and or your real property, right? Even in an extreme tyranny, for example, suppose someone thought, well, in a tyranny, people have no freedoms. Well, I could use a scenario to show how that can't be, because even if you imagine extreme tyranny, even if you imagine full chattel slavery, like what was in the South in the 1800s, it was horrific, right? But they could choose when to like blink their eyes, right? They could choose to scratch an itch in most cases, unless they're tied up or something like that, right? So you have the ability to self-determine various things, even in an extreme tyranny, even in a concentration camp or something. There was all kinds of freedoms, and if you realize that someone could decide when to blink their eyes or scratch or raise their arm up or not, right? So there's all sorts of things we can identify that they could in fact do without even punishment. So a tyranny is not actually marked by a severe lack of freedoms. It's more, we could give different definitions, but we would construct them. So I can construct the idea of what if the government didn't necessarily tell you what to do all that much. However, according to its own laws, it could take your body, your money, or your real property, like your house or whatever, anytime it wanted, as long as there was a law saying so, or even if there was a regulation written without quite a law, or there was leeway in how regulators do stuff, right? Well, now, and someone could say, well, it depends on how you define tyranny. Tyranny can mean different things. I would say, no, of course you can put words to different concepts, and someone else could construct a different scenario and distinctions in that scenario and say, well, this is what I mean by tyranny. But if the two of us were talking and they, quote unquote, defined tyranny differently, we wouldn't have to have any impasse if we could both think clearly. We would just modify the word and say, okay, this is a such and such tyranny. This other is a different, such and such tyranny, right? Whatever. It could be a democratic tyranny versus a military tyranny, whatever we want, but just modifying the word, or even say this is tyranny type A, this is tyranny type B, right? But we construct a scenario, but I am completely within my rights and reasonable logic, right? And within the general definition of tyranny to say, well, we could say that America even is a full tyranny, not even a soft tyranny or partial tyranny, because in any tyranny, they don't dictate every action, every blink of an eye, whatever, right? But in America, no subject of America, or as people often call them, citizens, but I prefer the word subject, can own any property. Literally, you feel like you can because sometimes the government doesn't take some of your property, right? But just like as I pointed out, in any tyranny, it's the case that you can sometimes exercise control over your body, for example, right? So in America, the government only takes about half your money in taxes rather than all of it, right? The tax rate in America is actually over 100%, by the way. And you might say, well, David, that can't be correct. Well, if you're an entrepreneur, you can very easily take in, like, say, $1 million and spend $800,000, or even more than $1 million, but let's say $800,000 on expenses. Those expenses, you're actually guilty until proven innocent, and the IRS can deny any of them, no matter how legitimate, if they want to. You see, so legally, you can be on the hook. You could have made $200,000 and be on the hook for $400,000 or more dollars in taxes if they want to. And again, there's no guilty and there's no innocent until proven guilty when it comes to taxation in the IRS. That's just how they operate. You're guilty until you prove. You have to proactively respond if they decide to examine you and audit you. And I've had all these things happen, right? So I personally experienced through jury duty and previously the draft and a ruling as well in the early 1900s. Slavery, first of all, is explicitly deemed legal in the United States as long as the government does it. I understand the word slavery can have emotional words, so can have an emotional sense, and for good reason. I affirm that the horrific slavery that happened in the 1800s and previously in America in the South is more extreme than jury duty. On the other hand, I wouldn't say it's necessarily more extreme than drafting, the way Lincoln did or the way FDR did, Lyndon Johnson, and whoever else, right? You draft someone, you're both forcing them to literally kill other people, which is a pretty major deal to do to somebody, is to make them kill another person who may or may not be innocent. And of course, you're can literally be sending them to be cannon fodder, like Abraham Lincoln did, right? he enslaved through a draft white and other boys up in the north, unless they could pay $300, and sent them on a torturous walk with terrible footgear, hundreds of miles, sent them to destroy and kill people's property, some of whom might have been innocent, right? Some of whom might not have directly been slave owners and so forth, and often literally to be literal cannon fodder, where their bodies were blown into a fine red mist. They were forced to do that. So they legally didn't have their bodies were taken from them in various ways. In jury duty, is it more mild? Yes, but it is still, if I did the kind of thing the government does in jury duty to like a woman, right? If I told her that she had to show up where I told her to and do what I told her to for 2 weeks or whatever, then that would be horrific and highly illegal, of course, right? So you don't own your, and plus they could pass a law, even if it seemingly violates the Constitution. That's not obviously much of an obstacle to begin with to making laws. And secondly, we all understand that a constitutional, without, people don't necessarily think it through, but they could pass a constitutional amendment regardless of you doing anything, right? That says anything, literally, right? If it's a constitutional amendment to 3/4 of the states and so forth, vote on something, then it could be whatever. It could be to torture you to death personally, and that would be fully legal and constitutional if it was a constitutional amendment saying that. So that's fully outside of your control, right? So you don't own your body. You don't even own the right not to be tortured to death if it's made legal, right? And nor do you own any of your money. Yes, you get to spend it and use it, but it can be as much as they decide is legal, can be taken away at any time. So that's an example of, I'm using scenarios, I'm building definitions. People can, as I said, build a different definition of tyranny, and then those would all be, you just modify or add something to the word. Say, okay, in this case I'm referring to what I'll call tyranny type A, this is tyranny type B, or whatever it might be, right? If people construct two distinct definitions, even if they have some overlap, but if they're distinct in any way, then you would just modify the word, or have a different word or whatever, and then you continue talking, and however you construct a definition of tyranny type A, you would need to keep that consistent. So this video has to be an overview because, of course, I can go on. It's already over almost an hour. But the basic idea here is that you can use scenarios that you're aware of as part of your consciousness screen, because the scenarios are not making any assertion about real life. I in a sense, asserted things about the actual real life America in what I said. However, if I was wrong in anything I said having to do with how America actually works, that wouldn't take away from the truths in what I was saying as I built scenarios. Because we could phrase it as, if there was a country called America that had such laws, that had a constitution that could be amended through 3/4 of the vote, right? Then it's the case that any one particular person could have anything taken away from them, and it would be legal. In other words, they legally don't own their body or their money or anything. If a country existed like that, we would call it a tyranny type A, right? If I called my version of tyranny, where you're not allowed to own any property, not even your own body, as a subject of a particular country, a tyranny type A. You see? So someone could say, well, America's not really like that and whatever, and I wouldn't necessarily argue them about that. I think I mostly used facts that are not in dispute regarding America, but the whatever's real about actual American laws is a separate issue from what I built with scenarios that would be more of a conditional. If there was a place like this, then it would be a tyranny type. And someone could simply say, well, I think tyranny type A's are perfectly fine, and they could try to explain that. You know what I'm saying? Like, so I don't, but by just defining tyranny or tyranny type A, where you don't get to own any property legally, in the sense that it can, and my definition of own is also constructed through the scenarios, right? What I mean by own is if it can legally be taken away from you at any time without any action or inaction on your part, then you don't own it. Just because you spend some money doesn't mean you own that money. In one sense, you did, right? Like, there's a difference between money in my bank account that I spend until and unless the government exercises its superior control over my money, than money in someone else's bank account. So we can certainly continue and distinguish that, right? But that's how this type of thinking works. Use scenarios. You don't need to argue. You can point out distinctions, put words to them, and you're building conditionals. And what you figure out that you know is true would be things like, again, if a country or government had these characteristics, it would qualify as a tyranny type A. However, let me point out that just because I called it a tyranny doesn't automatically make it evil. We would have to separately discover what would be evil, what would be the basis for morality, right? And for me, the answer is fairly simple, and it involves individual property rights. I believe, because believing otherwise gets real crazy real fast, I would say I understand, not believe, that individuals can own some property. The idea that a person cannot own anything, including their own body, gets real crazy real fast. We couldn't live like that for a second, and we don't. So pretty much all our actions are based on the idea that people can sometimes own property. So if we use that idea consistently, then we have a basis for morality. Using that, we could then say, okay, a tyranny type A in which the government used its, this idea of legality and so forth to deny any individual the ability to own any property whatsoever, that would be immoral, right? So that would be how we would go about showing that a tyranny like that would be immoral. But just calling it a tyranny doesn't make it immoral. So you have to be careful of that, right? If I construct a definition of tyranny using scenarios, then I don't get to just insert a connotation that goes with how the word is commonly used, like that it's wrong or evil or bad, magically, right? I would have to separately prove or explain why a tyranny type A that I constructed was in fact bad or evil, or whatever. I could also have constructed the same definition that I referred to as tyranny type A and called it a beneficial, wondrous place of goodness, right? And say by a beneficial, wondrous place of goodness, I mean, the same thing, right? A country where people can't own their property because the government figures out how to use their property much better than they can, and blah, blah, blah. Part of that, of course, would be an assertion that could be examined, right? But, okay, so as an overview, I'll stop there on the scenarios and stipulating. But that's how we build the meanings of our words. We don't. By the way, when we're building meanings of words, we're not defining things for society as a whole. We can often come up with specific meanings of words like religion or God or government or tyranny or love, right? Goodness, that are clear and specific and that capture a sort of common intended meaning of those words. But when you build the definition of something through a scenario, you're not dictating what it means in culture. You're clarifying what it means for yourself when you're using it, or for the sake of a discussion with another person. Everything about this method of how to know what's true will, of course, involve clarity rather than obfuscation. It might be a little confusing to hear this for the first time, or even a lot confusing. But ultimately, what's confusing is how people already think. It's fundamentally confused and vague, makes it difficult to get it right very quickly. But this is so radically important for your life, you can take my word for it if you don't see it right now, that it's worth even the sense, like when we talk about how to know what's true, people will come into a video like this with a sense of how much time it's worth spending on the topic. But how could you possibly know in advance how much time it's worth to devote to what I'm explaining to you? Maybe it's worth easily 1,000 hours. As a matter of fact, there's plenty of people that have spent over 1,000 hours with the various teachings that I've already done since 2013. As I record this, it's new to taking this publicly and openly. I had it within paid membership programs for a while. I have a different business that I was doing, like an entrepreneurial coaching program. But plenty of people have affirmed that spending over 1,000 hours on the law of implication and what I explain to people has been utterly worth it for them, and it's helped them in so many ways. Okay. I do want to, I could cut the video, into parts, but I will just continue to explain on this video. It was a huge breakthrough for me when I realized how mismatching was critical to the formula that I was working on. This recipe is a good word to use, actually, for thinking accurately. It's going to turn out that as we build on what we're directly aware of, remember I pointed out about if you're looking over a bunch of grass, like on a lawn, and you're trying to think, well, what is it that I'm directly aware of that I can't be wrong about? That's a basis for my knowledge. And you can notice, well, I don't know. And I went through this. I thought about this, and I didn't know the answer at first. I just noticed, well, it's odd, right? Because first of all, the moments are flowing. And so do I know what I saw last moment for sure? Is that I was looking for something that had to be correct, like an absolute basis, an absolute foundation that couldn't be wrong. And I was thinking, well, I'm not aware of like every blade of grass, like I mentioned earlier. So I'm looking at a lawn. I can understand the difference between conclusions about what's really out there, what color it really is, and so forth, versus my visual experience of it or my consciousness screen experience of what I feel like I'm seeing. But then even if I don't make conclusions about what's really out there, what about just in my own consciousness screen? How many blades of grass are there? I don't even know that. I don't even know how many there appear to be, right? So I don't even have full awareness of my own consciousness screen in the present. And yet I can notice something, and this is even an example of mismatching itself. I know I'm not aware of nothing. So there's a double negative there, but I had to put it that way, right? When I'm looking at that lawn, one thing that's clear is I wouldn't say that I'm not aware of a lawn at all or grass at all, right? I seem to be aware of, again, whether I'm aware of real actual grass out there in the real world is a separate question to whether I feel like I'm aware of grass, right? Just like the question of how many blades of grass do I feel like I see or do I experience seeing, I actually don't know the answer to that. But I do know the answer to do I seem, is another word, when I say feel, it's like seem, do I seem to be seeing a lawn? Yes. And even more basic, do I seem to be aware of nothing, or am I aware of nothing? I can tell, even if we think in terms of like pixels, like just because a bit of a metaphor, a bit like half literal, half metaphor here. So if you think of your conscious screen probably isn't made up of pixels in essence, but if we just think of it that way for a moment, I'm not like aware of all the pixels in my direct experience of what I'm seeing, but I'm also not aware of like no pixels. If someone said, am I seeing an elephant? Do I seem to see an elephant and there's no elephant there on the lawn? Then I could be very confident in saying no. There's definitely no elephant that I seem to be seeing. So what that shows, by kind of maybe giving these extreme examples of am I aware of nothing, is there an elephant there when there's not, is that there are things I can tell the difference between. Even if I'm not aware of everything or all the pixels of my consciousness screen, even in this moment, not even counting my memory of the previous moment, which I'm also not fully aware of, right? But I'm not even fully aware of what I'm seeing or even seem to be seeing in the moment. But I am aware of some large bits of it. And what I can be aware of is what I call mismatching. And a great way to understand what I mean is that, or to see the power of this, is to think in terms of how many bits of information, or like pixels, which are not the same but they're similar, they kind of point to the same concept, that it would take. Suppose you're looking at side by side, suppose that I put two of a copy of a painting, of the same painting, like the Mona Lisa, on the screen right now. So there'd be, on half the screen there'd be one copy of the Mona Lisa, on the other half there'd be another picture, right? I just copy and paste and double it up, right? So you'd be looking at two images of a painting and they look identical. They both look like the Mona Lisa to you. Now, to know whether they were, if I said, can you tell that those are absolutely identical, at least in your conscious screen? Do they seem, now you could say, well, they seem identical, which would mean I don't see any differences. And if we think of that in terms of mismatching, you could say, well, I can imagine what it would feel like in order to be clearly aware of differences, and that's not how it feels to me. I don't feel aware of differences. It doesn't match. My experience does not match what it would feel like if there were obvious differences. So that you could say they seem to be identical, and you can notice that they do seem to be identical. However, if to know that they're actually identical, even in your consciousness screen, you'd have to be aware of every pixel, so to speak, that makes up each of those pictures. So if I changed one pixel in the file, of one of them, and I put them both up, they would be different, and your experience of them would presumably be a bit different depending on how your eyes represent it. But if you, at some point, being certain, here's the conclusion or the critical piece here, or one of the two critical pieces. To know that two things match, to know how many blades of grass there are in your visual experience of a lawn, you would need to be aware of a lot of bits of information, hundreds, thousands, whatever, right? Tens of thousands. And something about that doesn't quite work for us, right? Like we're somehow not aware of that many bits of information consciously. But again, we're not aware of none, and yet we're not aware of like thousands of bits of information simultaneously in a certain sense. Like someone could say, well, how do you know you're not aware of them? And I'll say, well, no, the burden of proof is inverted there. You see, we're trying to build certain knowledge, what we're sure of. And if I'm saying that something is definitely true, I don't get to say, well, prove to me it's not true. I need to know that it is true. So at least for me personally, I'm not going to be saying I know how many blades of grass are in a lawn, or even my visual experience of a lawn. I don't know, right, when I'm looking at it. I don't know that for sure every pixel in both paintings that I'm looking at in my conscious experience. So I'm going to say they seem similar, but I don't have the confidence or the certainty of being aware of that many pixels. But if we think of the things that we're sure about, I'm aware there's not an elephant. I can tell those seem like the Mona Lisa, and they clearly don't seem like dogs playing poker or some other painting. And I'm confident of that. So there's some maybe relatively small number of bits of information that I'm extremely confident about. I would have no issue with. And there's a huge difference between that. Once again, it doesn't match. There's a huge difference between that and being confident of like every pixel in a painting. So here's where the second thing that you can see with the mismatching. If I did put up dogs playing poker, which is a painting, right? A painting of that right next to, on a split screen, right next to a painting of the Mona Lisa. You look at them both at the same time or whatever, even if you were looking at one after the other. And I said, are those two paintings the same? Or do they not match? You could, with complete confidence, tell me they don't match, right? Because it only takes a few bits of information, if you think about it, to tell that two totally different paintings don't match, or even two similar paintings that have a clear difference, right? If the Mona Lisa had a dark pink nose, right, and one and not the other, then you can see the difference there. And so however many bits of information, maybe 7, maybe 12, maybe 20, who knows, that we can be conscious of in a clear, certain way, there's some handful of a number that we can be. Because we also know the number is not 0 and it's not infinite, right? It's probably not, it doesn't seem to be in the tens of thousands or even hundreds, right? But there's some differences where I am completely comfortable living my life based on things as certain as that my visual experience, my direct consciousness screen experience of two totally different paintings, where my experience is different, where I can tell that there's two different images of paintings there. And of course, presumably two different actual, things on the computer screen or real life. I'm looking at real life paintings, whatever, right? So that's where the certainty comes in. When we back our way into knowledge, in a sense, and we can see that two things definitely don't match, and the only thing we're asserting, we're building our knowledge off of, no, these are two different things, but that'll come up. And it actually comes up constantly once we get used to seeing that, is this mismatching. So we're starting with differentiating our consciousness screen awareness from conclusions based on that and conclusions about the outside world based on it. We let go of whether or not we're observing the outside world and just are able to see or think in terms of our consciousness screen directly. We build scenarios that don't violate this idea of only a few bits at a time, right? That we're building carefully. If I say that there's 10 people on an island, I don't have to worry about the internal organs of those 10 people, right? Like there's all kinds of potential bits of information if there's 10 people on an island. But if I just say there's 10 people on an island, I've put a very small amount of bits of information so far in that scenario, because I've just left the little, all these potential pieces of information that could be about those people out. And if I wanted to insert any specific piece of information, if for some reason the state or existence of their kidneys mattered for some reason, then we'd introduce that in carefully, right? Kind of one at a time in a clear way. But as long as it doesn't, we don't need that. So it's a very simple thing to say 10 people on an island. There's very few bits of information. You don't have to know everything about islands or people to use that scenario in various ways. And so it relies on very few bits of information. And if you look at it carefully, you can see how it's constantly based on the difference, on obvious differences, like the difference between 10 and 9 or 11 people. There's actually a difference, right? You can actually look at math in terms of numbers not matching each other, being distinct from each other in a clear way. We don't, with simple things that we're building, we don't have to necessarily stop and notice the mismatching every time. Sometimes it's just we're dealing with kind of simple, big, obvious building blocks. But if you do stop and learn to think about it that way, for the sake of time, I'm not going to go on and give example after example. But all of my talking and videos that I'll do will be chock full of examples over time of this stuff. I'm just trying to give an overview, because I want you to just have some sense of what a recipe could be, or what the recipe is, but from your perspective, kind of what a recipe could be, because it could be anything almost. If I talk about how to know what's true, it could have to do with evidence and facts and not listening to fake news, or that, if there's a consensus among experts. If we start to notice how people actually assert things are true or proven or disproven or debunked, they're wildly different criteria and recipes than what I'm covering here. And there's plenty of stuff about real life. Was there election fraud in the 2020 US presidential election? That there's bits and pieces that we can identify and know, or conditionals. If such and such happened, then that means this, or that would lead to this, or whatever. But it's not about proving or disproving certain news events or reports, or some things that are not in the realm where you can prove them for certain. However, what you can do is narrow down and remove a whole bunch of contradictions, obfuscations, mistakes, so you greatly limit the gray area. So you're guessing within a smaller area, and a whole bunch of incorrect arguments and beliefs are removed. And the final concept is kind of an unknown, one that is known, not unknown, but a known idea. It's not, in practice, people violate the heck out of it, and they can't help but violating the heck out of it, because they didn't do the second part of the recipe properly. If you make words out of other words, if you define words in terms of other words, a definition is like a boundary, right? It's like a fence you build around the potential meaning of a word. If the fence itself is all undefined and blurry because it's just defined in terms of words defined in terms of other words that themselves are defined in terms of other words, and you just have this kind of infinite chain of blurriness, then it's very easy for people to play word games. And plus, when they want to manipulate you to keep power over people and promote certain beliefs or whatever it is, they feel superior, or all sorts of motivations people have, including good ones and pure ones. But people have a lot of confirmation bias, and so there's all this vagueness built into how people think and the building blocks on the words that people think. Words being often the building blocks of people's thoughts and their communication, of course, right? Or major parts of the building blocks. What we need to do is to hold our concepts constant. So if, on the one hand, we say, yeah, an individual person should be able to own some property, such as their body, and someone else, just two strangers having a conversation or having a vote somewhere, shouldn't be able to take away somebody's property, or else obviously it's not their property. If it could just be legitimately or morally taken away. Or if we equate legality with morality, then and kind of assumedly as we talk, then they kind of blend together in a way where if we say, well, it's legal to take their property away, where basically the person is asserting that it's moral to do so. People equivocate in business. They equivocate profit with net profit, gross profit, right? And often they want to make themselves feel like they're making progress, doing well. They want to brag and look like they're doing well for business reasons and personal reasons, right? Both ego and because they might think it'll get them ahead or get them more respect or more status or better partners might work with them or something. And so they're either fudging all the time at how much money they're making, right? But if you're drinking your own Kool-Aid, that can be a problem, and I see it all the time. Another sort of way that's similar or maybe identical, maybe similar to equivocation that comes up in business with marketing is people will pull in marketing templates, headlines that worked in the past and so forth. Those can be good to ask good questions. Let's say, oh, well, this headline worked in the past, this advertising method or this angle or argument or whatever type of commercial or video worked in the past. And so if you use that to ask questions about what might work now, that's constructive and useful. But if you use it to say, well, it worked there for them or in this place, and this is the same, and so what we're doing is similar, and so we'll use that, and it could work, or we expect it to work. That's similar to equivocation and very impactful in an unhelpful way. And I've made a lot of money or avoided not making a lot of money and therefore made money by not falling for that trap. And I see people, it's a very common trap, and plenty of ventures that I've been in, I've had to point that out and get us off of doing that. And it's been very helpful to not fall in that trap, because new situations, even if it's the same product as an advertisement that worked last year, the market can be different. They might have seen that argument before. There might be a different level of sophistication. There might be all kinds of different conditions that are hard to spot. The audience might be gotten from a different place or in a different way, and so these just pulling something in and thinking it's the same is not necessarily true. Somebody might have a successful romantic encounter with another person and then see them again in 2 days and expect to continue where they left off. But 2 days later is not the same as 2 days prior. And so you might want to be more sensitive, get a sense of where they're at, and continue. And that same thing could be true in business, right, in dealing with people. Someone might have agreed to something 2 days ago, and you figure, well, of course, they're just going to do what they agreed to 2 days later. That's not necessarily true. So you need to feel that out and treat it smartly often. So when we're used to equivocating with our words and our thinking, then that'll bleed over into related situations like I just mentioned with advertising, or expecting people to keep their word, or expecting a potential romantic partner or a new romantic partner or whatever to be the same now as they were 2 days ago, or whatever. And a lot of mistakes are made that way because something about the whole situation could be different. Their mood, the whatever could be going on, right? The build up to things and so forth. So we need to get good at understanding how to keep our concepts constant as we try to think through things and decision, everything that we are trying to think about accurately. We need to do that, and we set ourselves up to win the game by properly using scenarios and stipulating and conditionals, if this, then that. Okay, well, that's actually an overview of the recipe for thinking clearly. If and when you make that paradigm shift where you see or understand the idea of observing or realizing or that how things seem to you is true about how they seem, that your consciousness screen is distinct from conclusions about it, it's distinct from what your mind is telling you is different from what's true, it's different. You want to be able to have a thought about what's correct about the outside world or about whatever, or a conclusion without rubber stamping that conclusion, that sort of thing. You're separating raw inputs, in essence, from conclusions. And it's weird at first. Like you'd think it wouldn't be, in a sense. Like you might say, like, well, of course, David, a conclusion is different than the raw data. But it doesn't feel different a lot of times. You need to see how it doesn't feel different often, and how there isn't that kind of conceptual space between your mind, something being true, and between something being true and feeling true and so forth. Or between how things seem and a conclusion based on it. Really thinking through the idea, which we can do together as well for sure in the future, but the idea that your mind is not conscious, it's an extraordinary revelation. And it's a tough concept to keep constant as we think through the ramifications of that. But the ramifications of that are massive, that our mind itself is not aware of our consciousness. It's not conscious. And so it has to reinterpret any concept that involves consciousness, such as truth, love, goodness, things like that, have to be reinterpreted and twisted by our mind in order to process and remember them. Your mind literally cannot process the idea of goodness, love, consciousness, etc., literally. And so we're used to letting our mind do the thinking for us using a process I call associative thinking, as opposed to this type of thinking that I might call like alchemical thinking, where we're sort of creating and brewing ideas from scratch with scenarios and mismatching and so forth from the raw material of our consciousness screen, and being careful to hold concepts constant when it comes to alchemy or chemistry. Or you might think of proper lab technique if you've ever done a lab, but you're trying not to spill stuff and and have things be impure ingredients that you're mixing together. You want to mix together pure ingredients. You want to be careful with your measurements, so to speak, right? So we want to learn to contrast alchemical thinking, which is constructive, careful thinking, oversimplifying it, but like logical thinking, but based on consciousness screen starting point. Plenty of people use some degree of logic, but it's too tainted with confirmation bias and a misunderstanding of their starting point. So logic alone is nowhere near good enough. Logic, in essence, refers to this final thing here. It basically refers to holding the idea of holding concepts constant and not equivocating them. That's logic in a nutshell. These kind of so-called axioms and so forth, they're just examples of holding an idea constant. The proper use of the word all or not and some and like sometimes, always, things like that. But those things will be discussed as I continue. But it was critical to give you an overview here so you have an overall sense. Even if you feel confusion or like it's slipping through your fingers where you don't quite even remember what we talked about here, through mismatching, you can actually notice that there's plenty of stuff now that the recipe isn't. And you have just really a much better idea than you might even think now of where we're looking, what the basis for our thinking is, why it's possible to think accurately. That I've discovered something unique. I don't want accolades for that or praise, or I don't mind praise, but I'll appreciate it, but it's not about that. When I say it's unique, it's critical, because if this is unique, and you don't treat it as such, everything again in our culture and thinking is based on this not existing. And so we need to understand it's unique in order to realize that we need to rebuild our own mind and how we think about things, and not to import wrong ideas into our little space for accurate thinking. It's sort of like if we're doing an advertising campaign in my business or my previous business, and I point out to someone, guys, we need to look at this with fresh eyes, and this is a unique circumstance based on, it's a new year, there's a new whatever, the audience that is going to look at our marketing might be coming from a somewhat different place, right, or whatever. But looking at the situation as unique is critically important, and it's the same type of thing why I'm saying it's important for you to see this as unique, because it's assumed in a number of ways in our world that this can't exist, that you can't just be sure. Once you understand how to know that God exists, if you just walk up to someone and say, yeah, I know that God exists, they'll reinterpret what you're saying, and they'll just say, well, you can't know that. That's not possible. Or they'll say, yeah, okay, through faith. Yeah, I know too. And they'll mean something very different. You can't know something through faith. That's a contradiction in terms. Faith is what you do after you know something, or it's what you act on. But it's not a way of knowing. It's what you do in the absence or presence of knowing, but it's not. You can't know something just by waving your hand and saying, "Hey, magic wand, faith." Right? You have to know something by using a positive, actual method. You can't know something by just saying a word. I have faith. Oh, therefore I know it. That's the epitome of nonsense. But an incredible amount of people think that it's not nonsense because, it's circular. They don't know how to know what's true. They don't realize that, so they don't know how to know what's true about how to know what's true. And they ignore symptoms all over the place of the problems with not being able to know what's true. So there's plenty of stuff that you won't be able to know what's true regardless. But on the other hand, there's plenty of stuff where you will be able to know what's true, and a lot of it matters immensely, and it matters in a foundational way. It'll simplify your life tremendously. There's all kinds of dead ends and wrong paths that people follow they could know not to follow, and some of them are major life decisions that they could avoid that would, that really to their detriment. That will be to their detriment, but you could avoid. All right, excellent. I'll look forward to continuing to talk to you in future videos.